Usually when we talk about major internet outages, we think of like a severed fiber optic cable somewhere at the bottom of the ocean.
Right, or maybe some massive coordinated cyber attack or something.
Exactly. But on June 25, 2009, there was this unprecedented surge in global internet traffic. It was so intense that major news sites, search engines, social media platforms, they all just slowed to an absolute crawl.
I mean, many of them crashed entirely. And it wasn't a virus.
No, it wasn't. It was a single news event, the death of Michael Jackson.
It really remains a staggering moment to analyze. Just the sheer volume of people across the globe simultaneously picking up their phones or opening their laptops to search for confirmation. It essentially broke the web.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. It's a testament to a level of ubiquitous global fame that is almost difficult to comprehend today, given how fragmented our media landscape has become.
Right, because we're talking about a man who is literally recognized by the Guinness Book of World Records as the most famous person on Earth.
Yeah, someone whose global influence was actually compared to historical and religious figures.
And yet, the central tension of his life, the thing that makes his story so profoundly complex, is how that same man ended up dying heavily medicated, deeply in debt, and surrounded by controversies that persist to this day.
It's a massive contradiction.
It really is. So, to you listening, welcome to the Deep Dive. Today's mission is to unpack a massive stack of sources detailing the life, the career, and the deeply complicated legacy of the King of Pop.
There is a lot to get through.
There is.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this starting right at the beginning, because to really understand the man who lived in a literal amusement park, we have to understand the pressure cooker he came from in Gary, Indiana. Can you set the scene for us?
Yeah, absolutely. Gary is the absolute crucial foundation for understanding his psychology. We're looking at a working-class African-American family in the 1960s.
Right.
And we are talking about 10 children crammed into a tiny two-bedroom house on Jackson Street.
10 kids in 2 bedrooms. I can't even wrap my head around that.
It's incredibly tight quarters. And the parents, well, the father, Joe Jackson, was a former boxer and crane operator who also played guitar. And his mother, Catherine, played clarinet and piano.
So music was always there.
Exactly. Music was woven deeply into the fabric of the household. But the environment was incredibly pressurized. Michael made his public debut at just 6 years old.
Wow, 6?
Yeah, and he rapidly became the prodigy and lead singer of the Jackson 5. But it's important to understand the reality of their early career. It wasn't glamorous. Our sources detail their grueling tours on what was known as the Chitlin Circuit.
Yeah, I've heard that term before in music history, but what did that actually entail for a kid who was, essentially in the first grade?
Well, the Chitlin Circuit was a collective name for performance venues throughout the eastern, southern, and upper Midwest areas of the United States. They were venues that were safe and acceptable for African-American entertainers during the era of racial segregation.
Okay, so a vital network for Black artists.
Yes, but for the Jackson 5, it meant performing in incredibly tough clubs, like cocktail lounges that featured strip teases.
Wait, really? Little kids performing in strip clubs?
Yeah, these kids were opening for legendary seasoned adult acts like Etta James and Gladys Knight in these incredibly adult environments. It was a relentless, exhausting grind to hone their craft.
I can't even imagine the toll that takes.
It was intense, but it eventually led to them winning amateur night at the Apollo Theater in Harlem in 1967. And ultimately, that led to signing with Motown Records.
It's just brutal to think about, though. A child prodigy carrying the financial weight of a massive family. And reading through these sources, the romanticized, child star narrative just completely falls apart.
It really does.
It reminds me of a ruthless, hyper-competitive athletic training camp where they just break you down completely to build a champion. I mean, Michael later described his father sitting at rehearsals with a belt ready to whip them for a misstep.
Which is horrifying.
It is. I have to ask, does generational greatness always require this kind of traumatic, childhood erasing sacrifice?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, that absolute loss of a normal childhood laid the psychological groundwork for literally everything that followed in his life.
Right.
On one hand, it forged his unmatched perfectionist work ethic. I mean, he learned how to command an audience of adults before he fully learned how to be a person.
That is a crazy way to put it, but so true.
But on the other hand, it triggered a lifelong desperate pursuit of the childhood he felt was stolen from him. Joe Jackson later acknowledged the physical discipline, though, it's worth noting, some of Michael's brothers defended it as a way of keeping them off the rough streets of Gary.
Sure. But for Michael himself?
For Michael, it was a profound trauma.
So how does a kid who was essentially a human ATM for his family break free from that machine? Like, how does he transition from the Motown child star to a solo artist without just fading into obscurity like so many others do?
He doesn't just transition, he completely rewrites the economics of the music industry.
Really? How so?
Well, first, the Jackson 5 left Motown for Epic Records. Then Michael met the legendary producer Quincy Jones while playing the Scarecrow in the film version of The Wiz.
Oh, right. The Wiz.
Yeah, and that connection led to his 1979 solo album, Off the Wall. It was a massive critical and commercial success, selling over 20 million copies. But behind the scenes, Jackson was revealing himself to be an incredibly sharp businessman.
Okay, I'm curious about this part.
By 1980, he secured a 37% wholesale royalty rate on his albums.
Break that down for us because, wholesale royalty rate sounds like a bunch of accounting jargon. Why was that such a big deal?
At the time, standard artist royalties were in the low single digits.
Wait, single digits?
Yeah, very low. A 37% wholesale rate meant that for every dollar a record store paid the distributor to stock his album, Michael Jackson kept 37 cents.
Wow. That is an insane jump.
It was an unheard of level of leverage. He had essentially forced the industry to acknowledge that he was the primary driver of their profits.
That's incredible.
But even with Off the Wall being a masterpiece, Jackson was frustrated. He felt it didn't win enough Grammys. So he was determined that his next album would be so undeniable that the industry would have to bow to it.
And boy, did it ever. Thriller, released in 1982. It becomes the best-selling album in human history, with an estimated 70 million copies sold worldwide.
It's hard to even fathom those numbers.
It is. 7 top 10 singles on the Billboard Hot 100. It stayed in the top 10 for 80 consecutive weeks. It's almost hard to wrap your head around that. But here's where it gets really interesting. Because of what he did to MTV.
Oh, absolutely.
I used to think of Jackson's impact on MTV like a cultural wrecking ball. But reading these sources, it's more profound than that. Before him, MTV was essentially a visual rock radio station with a strict bouncer at the door, keeping black artists out.
That's very true.
CBS Records actually had to threaten to pull all their artists just to get the network to play Billie Jean. Jackson didn't just sneak past the bouncer. He bought the club and entirely changed the music policy.
That's a perfect way to conceptualize it. He shifted MTV's entire format from rock to pop and R&B, and he turned music videos into high-budget cinematic art.
Right, especially with the 14-minute zombie epic for Thriller.
Exactly. And a major turning point in all this was the 1983 television special Motown 25. He performed Billie Jean and debuted the moonwalk, a move he actually learned from dancer Jeffrey Daniel.
I didn't know that's where he learned it.
Yeah, and that broadcast went out to 47 million people. That single performance elevated him from a pop star to a global deity. At the 1984 Grammys, he won a record-breaking 8 awards in a single night.
So he wins. He conquers the world. I mean, Time magazine literally calls him a one-man rescue team for the music business. But if you're literally the most famous person on the planet, where do you go from there?
You retreat. The sheer scale of his success pushed Jackson into an incredibly isolated stratosphere.
Which makes sense. How could you live a normal life?
You couldn't. As the New York Times wrote, during that era, there was Michael Jackson and there was everybody else. And that isolation ushers in the era of the Gilded Cage.
The Gilded Cage.
Right. By the mid to late 1980s, he releases the Bad album, becoming the first artist to have 5 Billboard #1 singles from a single record. But the media scrutiny begins to pivot away from his musical genius and hyper-focuses on his changing physical appearance.
Yeah, I want to get into the facts of this because the public narrative was wild.
Yeah.
The tabloids speculated he was purposefully bleaching his skin to look white, essentially rejecting his race. But the sources provide the actual medical reality, right?
They do. In 1986, his dermatologist, Dr. Arnold Klein, diagnosed Jackson with vitiligo.
And what exactly does that do?
It's a chronic condition that destroys skin pigment and causes uneven white blotches. Klein also diagnosed him with lupus. So to manage the severe blotching, Jackson used fair-colored makeup and prescription skin depigmenting creams.
Okay, so that's what resulted in his extremely pale appearance.
Yes. He also underwent plastic surgeries. Now, in his autobiography, Jackson claimed he only had 2 rhinoplasties and a cleft chin surgery. Though it's worth mentioning, his own mother later speculated he became addicted to cosmetic procedures.
But the tabloids in the 80s and 90s, they didn't care about the medical truth at all. They just ran with the wildest story.
Oh, the stories are everywhere.
Yeah, like that he slept in a hyperbaric chamber to slow aging, that he offered $1 million to buy the bones of the Elephant Man, and that he was taking his pet chimpanzee, Bubbles, on tour.
It became a circus.
It did. Which makes me wonder, did the media organically create the Wacko Jocko caricature just to tear down a powerful black superstar? Or did Jackson initially feed these stories to the tabloids to maintain a mythical, untouchable aura, only for the monster to eventually spin out of his control?
What's fascinating here is that the sources suggest it was a dangerous game of both.
Really? He fed them the stories?
Well, his manager at the time, Frank DeLeo, admitted that while Jackson didn't sleep in the hyperbaric chamber, he did own one, and he did have a deep personal interest in the Elephant Man. Jackson seemingly understood that mystery drives fame.
But it totally backfired.
Profoundly. The tragedy is how his actual painful medical condition, the vitiligo, was completely overshadowed by public mockery. The media narrative alienated him further from a society he was already struggling to connect with.
So we have this tension building into the early 1990s. In some ways, his cultural power still seems untouchable. I mean, he completely redefines the Super Bowl halftime show in 1993, turning it from marching bands into the mega spectacle we know today.
A total paradigm shift for the NFL.
Exactly. And that same year, he sits down for a live interview with Oprah Winfrey. 90 million viewers tune in. He admits his father's abuse, he reveals his vitiligo diagnosis to the world, and he insists he just wants the childhood he never had.
He seemed very genuine in that moment.
Yeah, he seems vulnerable, but in control. So how does the floor suddenly fall out?
The second half of 1993 marks the sharpest, most devastating turning point in his life. He faced allegations of child sexual abuse involving a 13-year-old boy named Jordan Chandler.
And the timeline of this is messy, right?
The sequence of events detailed in the sources is incredibly complex. In July 1993, Jordan's father, Evan Chandler, was secretly recorded threatening to ruin Jackson's career with a, quote, carefully planned plot.
A carefully planned plot. That's a direct quote.
Yes. Shortly after that recording, Chandler demanded a $20 million payment from Jackson. Jackson refused. And it was following that financial refusal that Chandler went public with the abuse allegations.
Okay, and this triggers a massive criminal investigation. While Jackson is on an overseas tour, prosecutors raid his Neverland Ranch but find no incriminating evidence.
Not at all.
Then, in a highly publicized move, the prosecutor gets a court order to conduct a strip search of Jackson to photograph his genitalia, based on a drawing provided by the accuser. The news agencies later reported that the description did not match the police photographs.
That's what the report stated, yes.
So if the evidence isn't matching up, why does this end in a massive payout?
Because of a vicious legal catch-22. In the midst of the criminal probe, Evan Chandler filed a $30 million civil lawsuit against Jackson. Jackson's legal team attempted to pause the civil case until the criminal investigation concluded. The reason is a concept tied to double jeopardy and self-incrimination.
How does that work in this context?
Well, if Jackson testified in the civil trial to defend himself, prosecutors could use every single word of that testimony to build their criminal case against him.
Oh, wow. So he was trapped.
Exactly. But the judge denied the request to pause the civil suit. Facing this immense pressure and an absolute inability to safely defend himself in civil court, Jackson's insurance company stepped in.
So they just paid to make it go away.
In January 1994, they agreed to a civil settlement of $18.3 million. That was $15.3 million to the boy and $1.5 million to each parent.
So what does this all mean? If you're listening to this, you might think a settlement is an admission of guilt. But from a strictly legal standpoint, settling a civil suit isn't that right.
Yeah.
It allowed him to avoid an impossible legal trap.
Legally speaking, yes.
Criminal charges were never filed in 1993, and the police investigation was closed due to a lack of evidence. But in the court of public opinion, paying out over $18 million permanently altered his legacy. It cast a shadow that he could never, ever outrun.
It did. But professionally, he kept going. He released the album History, he got married, had children, and crucially, around this time, he executed one of the most brilliant financial moves in music history.
Okay, let's hear it.
He merged his ATV music catalog, which notably included the publishing rights to most of the Beatles songs, with Sony for a massive $95 million upfront payment.
Wait, I want to pause on the ATV catalog because this is where his financial story gets incredibly confusing later on. He merges this catalog for $95 million up front. How does music publishing actually work, and why was this so valuable?
Right, so music publishing is essentially owning the underlying composition of a song, the lyrics and the melody. So every time a Beatles song from that catalog was played on the radio, used in a commercial, or covered by another artist, Jackson got paid. It's a phenomenally lucrative asset, essentially a machine that prints money while you sleep. Jackson owned half of the newly formed Sony ATV catalog, making him incredibly asset-rich.
Which makes the downward spiral of the 2000s even more paradoxical. Because fast forward to 2003, a journalist named Martin Bashir releases a documentary called Living with Michael Jackson.
Yes, a massive cultural moment.
Bashir followed Jackson for months, and the broadcast included footage of Jackson discussing sharing his bedroom with children. Jackson fiercely insisted his words were misunderstood and that the sleepovers were entirely non-sexual, but the public backlash was instantaneous.
It was explosive.
And it leads to a second wave of allegations.
Yes. In December 2003, Jackson was formally charged with child molestation, leading to a grueling, highly publicized criminal trial in 2005. At the end of it, the jury acquitted Jackson on all counts. Furthermore, later releases of FBI files showed the agency had investigated him for years, tracking him globally, and found absolutely no evidence of criminal conduct. He was legally cleared.
But the trial completely broke him. Our sources describe him fleeing the United States, living as a recluse in Bahrain as a guest of royalty.
Yeah, he just had to escape.
And this is where that financial paradox we talked about earlier rears its head. He owns half of the Sony ATV catalog, arguably the most valuable intellectual property in music history. Yet by 2006, he is on the verge of bankruptcy.
It's hard to believe.
He's involved in 47 different lawsuits, and he is hundreds of millions of dollars in debt. I'm trying to figure out how someone worth billions on paper can't pay their electric bill.
This raises an important question about liquidity versus asset wealth and the predatory ecosystem that surrounds a megastar. Jackson had the assets, but he had no cash flow.
He had no liquid cash.
Right. The post-trial years reveal a man entirely drained. He was supporting a massive entourage, maintaining the Neverland Ranch Zoo and amusement park, paying out legal settlements, and funding his lifestyle by taking out massive loans against his share of the Sony catalog.
Oh, I see.
When he stopped touring and releasing mega hits, the exorbitant interest rates on those loans began to eat him alive. The machine that had fed off his talent since he was a 6-year-old boy in Gary, Indiana, had bled him dry.
It's like a king starving to death inside a palace made of solid gold. He had the wealth, but he couldn't spend it. And that desperate financial reality is what forces him to attempt a massive comeback in 2009.
He really had no other choice.
He announces the This Is It residency, a grueling 50-show run in London. He had to do it to generate liquid cash.
And the rehearsal footage for this is it showed he still possessed that undeniable stage magic. But behind the scenes, his health was incredibly fragile.
He couldn't sleep, right?
Exactly. To manage his severe insomnia and the physical pain of rehearsing, he employed a personal physician, Dr. Conrad Murray. On June 25, 2009, Murray administered a fatal overdose of the surgical anesthetic propofol.
Which is wild.
It is. It's a drug meant for hospital operating rooms, not a residential bedroom. Michael Jackson died of cardiac arrest at the age of 50. Conrad Murray was later convicted of involuntary manslaughter.
And the moment his death was announced, we circle back to where we started. The internet crashes, the world stops. And in this incredibly dark irony, the financial ruin he faced in life was instantly reversed by his death.
The posthumous economics are staggering. Because he was no longer spending, his estate could finally capitalize on his massive assets.
Right.
They signed a $250 million deal with Sony, the largest recording contract in history. That rehearsal footage was turned into the documentary Michael Jackson's This Is It, which became the highest-grossing concert film ever.
Wow.
His estate generated billions, easily clearing his debts and making him the highest-earning deceased celebrity for years.
But the controversies obviously didn't die with him. The legal legacy remains incredibly complex. Our sources note that posthumous abuse lawsuits were filed by choreographer Wade Robson and James Safecheck, who both alleged abuse years after explicitly defending Jackson under oath in the 1990s and 2000s.
Yes, that complicated things further.
There's also a 2026 lawsuit filed by the countryHe siblings alleging abuse. These cases have faced various legal dismissals, appeals, and public debate, and they remain a highly contentious part of his posthumous narrative.
The ongoing legal battles represent a permanent fracture in how the public views him. Yet, simultaneously, the sources emphasize an undeniable, almost unmatched global cultural imprint.
Right, outside of the U.S. context.
Exactly. In Africa, his ability to unite audiences across borders was compared to Nelson Mandela. In India, his humanitarian themes drew comparisons to Gandhi. There's an incredible detail in the sources about a remote tribe in the Amazon.
Oh, I read this part.
When researchers made contact, the tribe had never heard of the moon landing. They didn't know who the most famous soccer players were, but they knew who Michael Jackson was.
That is the ultimate paradox of the king of pop. The man whose death almost broke the modern internet, but whose music had reached people entirely off the grid. So to you listening, we leave you with this final thought to mull over.
It's a big one.
It is. Can we ever truly reconcile the world-healing, barrier-breaking joy of Michael Jackson's art with the profound tragedy, isolation, and controversy of his actual life? When someone becomes the most famous person in human history, do they cease to be human at all? Or do they just become a mirror reflecting all of our own brilliance, our demands, and our brokenness back at us? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.